talk about how the cyber criminal use of encryption methodologies. How do they use it against us, right? Not just the fact that we're not doing it right, but oftentimes they bypass our security because of a weakness or vulnerability that we may not even have known about, right? A 0-day, a new thing that we weren't aware of when we created that methodology, which is why Phil was talking about kicking the tires on the new encryption, right? We really have to understand it. And going back in time, right? The oldest attacks against a cryptographic system were brute force. What they do? Oh, they guess the password. They kept trying to guess it. But then we've also seen them approach different aspects, the different fundamental components of the encryption, which is why we talked about them, whether that was the key, right? In cases where they did a ciphertext only attack. In other words, they tried to get us to give them the key by giving them part of the encrypted message, right? Or encrypting something that we should have done through a chosen plain text attack, right? They'll tell us, hey, encrypt this, and then they look at the resulting encryption to try and guess at the key used, right? So there are different ways that they can trick us into encrypting things because this is often done publicly, right? And so the point is they do that. Sometimes they try and give us some encrypted text and then get us to decrypt it for them, right? The other half of the message so that they can then guess how we decrypted it, what that part of the key was, or the secret part of the key, or the private key side of things. And then when they know a plain text attack, that's actually where they give something they specifically know so that they can see at the end what the message looks like and then reverse engineer into the actual math so they can guess it. Dual key in a logarithm attack is basically when they try to do both sides simultaneously to get you to share both components and see how they're linked so that they can then guess at the overlying passwords. Anything you guys want to add to that?
I'd like to point out, a real world example that targeted, a radio communication system. It's some of our listeners may be aware of it. It's known as the Tetraburst attack. There were 5 CVEs. Oh, so we have a slide. So I'll leave that there. I'll skip that and just say.
No, keep going, Phil. You got it. This is
okay. So good deal. So yeah, there were 5 CVEs that came out, and one specifically onerous attack basically undermined the weak encryption that was in place and provided complete access to text, voice, data comms without the need of managing or having access to the decryption key for that matter. And so, if you think about the potential effects of such an attack on our first responders, incident risk management, whatever that may be, EOD, you have the potential of putting in danger individuals who are deploying and responding to various events and or emergencies for that matter, thinking that they are communicating in a circle of trust when in actuality adversaries and or threat agents are aware of their placement and their intent. And so that's just one example. The other example is when using radio comm systems as a way of command and control for industrial control systems and or pipelines for that matter, the gas pipeline, that this second critical flaw permitted attackers to inject data into the command and control channels of this critical infrastructure, creating the opportunity to close pipelines, reroute trains, as stated here, trigger blackouts, but overall undermine the trust in our critical infrastructure, as well as sow chaos at a potentially critical period in time. And so we can only imagine, and you couple this into the statement that CISA made earlier this year, that nation threat actors have exploited and established persistence in our critical communication infrastructure. They're not necessarily actioning it, but they are maintaining and holding that connection to use at a future point in time. And so it is critical for us to be able to characterize and contextualize our cryptographic trust fabric so that we can make sound decisions as to whether or not we have a false sense of trust or an appropriate sense of trust when necessary. But yeah, the Tetraburst attack is a very interesting attack. There are ways to, once again, mitigate these things, but it all starts with having an understanding, visualizing what you're using today.
Really, and implementing things that call to accountability folks who build stuff like this, right? So in this case, it was a flaw built in that everybody knew about except for the people who trusted the devices, right? And so it was kind of a twofold, attack here. One is the attack on the trust because they knew about it. The second piece is an attack on the methodology by the bad guys because it was possible, right? And that's really, as we look into these things, I mean, it's bad on both sides.
You can argue, I mean, it's very much a supply chain security issue, and supply chain security is everyone's responsibility, the consumer as well as the producer. And so, how do we keep each other honest? That's the real question.
Yeah, and it goes back to that transparency. We got to know that they're doing it right because we've asked the right questions and they've told us they've done it right, and then they're showing us that they've done it right, right? So there's all those aspects of it. We've also seen the bad guys using encryption too high, right? It's much more difficult to find as they inject the malware and other things if it's encrypted on the way through, right? Especially if we don't have the key. So really understanding that and understanding that 80% of the threats currently are now delivered through encrypted channels. Why? Because they know it's harder for us to find them if it's encrypted. Just as we use encrypted to protect, they're using it to hide the actual malware. And when we look at it, only 20% of organizations have mechanisms for decrypting and scanning encrypted traffic. Well, that's kind of what we're going for here. We really need to get our hands wrapped around that. We need to prepare ourselves. And I'll mention some of the stuff that we've developed with Merlin to get there, right? So really understanding it. Also want to mention steganography. This is when we see a picture of or a video of a cat, right? This is often shared through social media and Discord and other methodologies. The point is it's disguising and concealing the malware in normal things, right? So that they get us to click the link, they use this in combination with phishing. And when we also rely on the firewalls to do everything for us, when they actually aren't capable or by definition aren't looking at things over a certain size. So we really have to understand how do we get our hands around it? How do we understand how they're doing these things if we're not looking for it? That's really, and not because we're a monitoring company. Please go ahead.
Well, and think about if a firewall is doing the job in line of trying to make sure bad things don't happen in your network live, there's going to be certain limitations on what that firewall can do. So it seems incredible maybe at first to consider that firewalls may not look at files over a certain size, but it just can't it can't keep up, right? It has a lot that it has to do, which is why having multiple layers to your defense strategy is so important.
Agreed. And really because of attacks like on-path attack or man in the middle, as I'm used to referring to it, where an attacker intercepts or alters the communication chain, right? So they're sitting somewhere in the middle. And the assumption is anytime we send anything between any two places across something I like to call the internet or the dark web or the cloud, right? It's all the same place. When we send something from A to B, how do we know somebody isn't listening? And so the assumption has to be that they are. We have to take the assumption that just because we're sending it between A and B know who each other are, doesn't mean that it's necessarily secure unless we work hard to make it secure, right? So we have to stop assuming. And so when I received a note from the VA, a letter from the VA saying, hey, all of the data, including my files, were transferred between two sites using the file transfer protocol, which is simply clear text, between two places. They said, but it wasn't hacked. And I'm like, well, how would you know? Right? Because it was across the internet. They don't know if somebody was listening or not. They made the assumption that somebody wasn't, but then they wrote me a letter anyway and offered free credit monitoring, right? There's a reason why they have to do that, because they're responsible for sending and receiving that communication. Responsibility is integral to the communication itself, right? We have to build it in. Otherwise, they will do this. They will sit in the middle. They will manipulate the data. They will inject data as well as capture data, right? They can do a lot of horrible things if we give them a chance. And we've seen it, right? Especially like in the Tetra one. This is another manufactured backdoor. an existing algorithm was baked into the radio sold. And the problem is it would allow someone to snoop on the communications, right? Because all they had to know was that key, and they were able to use it because it was built in. And that really speaks to what we talked about with the Tetra attack, right? So they're building a backdoor in. We've seen this multiple times in laptops and other methodologies, often built by China, right? That we've seen built into these methodologies. And the problem is that we trust that. We buy the product, we assume it's secure. They tell us it's secure.
Yeah. They'll tell us it's encrypted with AES 256, and they won't expand any beyond that, right? So